The early hours of March 18, 1943, unfolded like any ordinary training period at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley observed his cadre of dive bomber trainees as they ascended into the cockpits of their SBD Dauntless aircraft, the very same formidable machines that had decisively altered the course of the Pacific conflict at Midway just 9 months prior. Yet, a disquieting anomaly in the statistical data gnawed at him. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Flatley had tragically lost a greater number of aviators to mishaps during training exercises than he had experienced in actual combat engagements throughout the entirety of the arduous Guadalcanal campaign. The emerging pattern was both unmistakable and profoundly alarming. These were not the blunders of inexperienced recruits or the consequence of mechanical malfunctions. Instead, seasoned pilots, individuals who had already endured and survived the crucible of combat missions, were executing textbook-perfect dive-bombing maneuvers only to plunge inexplicably into the vast expanse of the ocean. Reports emanating from other naval air training facilities corroborated this profoundly unsettling phenomenon. At NS Corpus Christi, at NS Pensacola, and indeed, at airfields scattered across the nation, dive bomber pilots were perishing under circumstances that defied all tactical logic. They would meticulously execute the inverted roll, transition into their precipitous dive, maintain the precise 70-degree angle mandated by operational doctrine, track their designated targets with unwavering precision through the bomb site, and then, for reasons unknown, simply fail to initiate recovery. There were no frantic radio transmissions signaling distress, no erratic flight patterns indicative of control system failures. The aircraft would steadfastly maintain its steep dive trajectory, plummeting past the designated bomb release point, past the critical safe pullout altitude, until the inexorable laws of physics rendered any hope of recovery utterly impossible. Subsequent crash investigations consistently revealed intact control surfaces, engines functioning flawlessly, and airframes devoid of damage save for the catastrophic impact. It was as if the pilots had inexplicably succumbed to sleep at the most perilous juncture. However, they had not merely fallen asleep. The insidious reality unfolding within those cockpits was far more sinister than mere fatigue. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been receiving a growing number of troubling field dispatches since late 1942, but the sheer magnitude of the crisis only became undeniably apparent when squadron after squadron began to tragically lose pilots to what official reports euphemistically termed failure to recover from dive. This carefully worded phrase served to obscure a harsher, more inconvenient truth that no one seemed willing to directly confront. The very dive bombing technique that had secured a pivotal victory at the Battle of Midway was now systematically claiming the lives of the skilled aviators who had so painstakingly mastered it. The inherent precision and rigorous discipline that rendered dive bombing so devastatingly effective against Japanese naval assets had, ironically, inadvertently created a physiological predicament that the human body was simply not designed to withstand. Commander Flatley initiated a concerted effort to compare observations and data with other training officers, and from these discussions, a profoundly unsettling consensus began to crystallize. The pilots who were succumbing to these mysterious accidents were not the careless individuals who habitually cut corners, or the reckless daredevils who habitually pushed beyond their operational limits. On the contrary, they were the meticulously precise, by-the-book aviators who adhered to established doctrine with unwavering fidelity. They were the ones who held their dives to the absolute last possible second, driven by an unyielding commitment to maximizing bombing accuracy. They were the men who had internalized the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of dive bombing. Every additional 100 feet of altitude maintained at the point of bomb release translated into potentially dozens of feet of deviation from the intended target. Against a rapidly maneuvering enemy warship, that seemingly minor missed distance could spell the crucial difference between a successful strike and a wasted ordnance. Consequently, these dedicated pilots had rigorously trained themselves to wait, to endure that screaming, vertical plunge, to keep the target precisely centered within their sights until the absolute final fraction of a second before initiating pullout. And it was precisely this unwavering discipline, this profound commitment to unparalleled accuracy, that was now tragically claiming their lives in numbers so significant that it threatened to cripple the entire dive bomber force. What had remained tragically uncalculated was the profound physiological impact upon the human body when a 2-ton aircraft transitions from a 70-degree dive at a velocity of 300 miles per hour into a recovery arc. While the underlying mathematical principles were remarkably straightforward, the physiological ramifications were anything but simple. When a pilot exerted force on the control stick to commence the pull-out maneuver, he was not merely altering the aircraft's trajectory. He was simultaneously subjecting his entire circulatory system to immense gravitational forces that it had never evolved to effectively manage. At the nadir of a typical dive bombing pullout, pilots routinely experience between 5 and 7 Gs, meaning their blood instantaneously weighed 5 to 7 times its normal mass. This blood, obedient to the unyielding laws of physics, was mercilessly drained away from the brain and involuntarily pooled in the lower extremities and legs. The entire sequence of events transpired with a rapidity that outpaced conscious thought. The initial symptom was a loss of peripheral vision, a phenomenon aviators colloquially referred to as grayout. The outer edges of the visual field would gradually dim into a colorless, indistinct fog as the retinas, deprived of oxygen-rich blood, began to progressively cease functioning from the periphery inward. This critical stage typically manifested at approximately 4 Gs and afforded the pilot a mere 2 seconds of ominous warning. This was swiftly followed by the onset of tunnel vision, where only the central portion of the visual field remained functional, constricting into a narrow, circular aperture that rendered the accurate reading of flight instruments nearly impossible. At 5.5 Gs, the vast majority of pilots would experience complete blackout, a total and absolute loss of vision while technically retaining consciousness. At 6 Gs and beyond, consciousness itself would inexorably begin to wane and ultimately vanish. The brain, receiving perhaps only 30% of its normal blood flow, would simply shut down as a desperate, self-preservative mechanism. Herein lay the profound treachery of dive bombing. The entirety of the pull-out maneuver, from its initiation to the aircraft achieving wings-level flight, typically spanned a duration of 4 to 6 seconds. However, G-induced blackout could commence in less than 2 seconds, with complete unconsciousness often following within 4 seconds. The timing was nothing short of catastrophic. A pilot would initiate his pullout, acutely sense the escalating G-forces, perceive his vision beginning to constrict, and then his conscious mind would tragically vanish at the precise moment when his cognitive faculties were most desperately required. The control stick would slacken, the pull-out maneuver would abruptly halt midway through its arc, and the aircraft would continue its precipitous dive into the unforgiving water with an unconscious pilot helplessly at the controls. Even more agonizingly, when the oppressive G-forces finally abated, either because the aircraft entered a terminal, uncontrollable spiral or simply because it impacted the water, consciousness would occasionally return in that final, fleeting second, granting the pilot just enough horrifying awareness to comprehend his imminent demise. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine swiftly initiated a series of rigorous tests at the centrifuge facility in Pensacola, subjecting volunteer pilots to the precise G-force profiles that had been meticulously measured during actual dive bombing pullouts. The results were profoundly sobering. When pilots were explicitly forewarned of impending high G-forces and instructed to consciously tense their leg and abdominal muscles, a technique known to delay the onset of blackout by a crucial second or two, they were able to maintain consciousness through pullouts that would otherwise render them completely incapacitated. However, in the unforgiving reality of actual flight, during the adrenaline-fueled final seconds of a dive, with the target rapidly hurtling towards them, and with their entire attention singularly focused on maintaining the bomb site's pipper precisely centered, pilots invariably forgot to execute the anti-G straining maneuvers. Their conscious minds were simply too saturated with the immediate demands of the task at hand. By the time they initiated the pullout, it was already irrevocably too late to adequately prepare their bodies for the crushing forces that were about to descend upon them. The German Luftwaffe had, in fact, grappled with this identical problem 4 years earlier, and their ultimate solution proved to be as brutally effective as it was straightforward. In 1939, during the combat trials of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka over the battlefields of Poland, the Luftwaffe tragically lost 7 aircraft in a single week to a series of unexplained dive accidents. Pilots, who had consistently performed flawlessly in training exercises, were inexplicably auguring straight into the Polish farmland, their bombs still securely attached. The subsequent investigation unequivocally revealed that experienced pilots were blacking out during pullouts at rates that rendered the Stuka operationally unsustainable. However, unlike the Americans who would confront this identical crisis years later, the Germans benefited from the presence of a visionary engineer named Hans Ulrich Rudd, who was working directly with the design teams at Junkers. Rudd vehemently advocated for a radical solution that completely circumvented the fallibility of the human element. By early 1940, every Stuka rolling off the production line was equipped with an innovative automatic pull-out system. The mechanism itself was ingeniously simplistic. The pilot would preset a desired recovery altitude on a barometric switch before commencing his dive, and upon the aircraft reaching that designated altitude, pneumatic actuators would automatically haul the control column backward, entirely irrespective of the pilot's current actions or state. Even if the pilot was utterly unconscious, even if he had completely relinquished his grip on the control stick, the aircraft would autonomously recover from its dive. The system incorporated a mechanical override, a prominent red handle that the pilot could pull to manually regain control. However, activating that override necessitated a conscious decision. If the pilot had succumbed to blackout, the automated system would, without any input whatsoever from him, effectively save his life. The consequences of this innovation were both immediate and profoundly dramatic. Stuka loss rates attributable to dive accidents plummeted by over 80% within a mere 3 months of the system's widespread deployment. Pilots frequently recounted feeling the control stick forcibly wrench itself backward during pullouts they barely remembered initiating. Some aviators described regaining full consciousness in level flight with absolutely no recollection of the preceding 5 seconds. The automatic system also yielded an unanticipated secondary benefit. It empowered pilots to sustain their dives for extended durations. The knowledge that the aircraft would independently initiate recovery at a preset altitude meant pilots could keep their bomb sights meticulously fixed on target through the final, critical seconds without the added burden of consciously initiating the pullout. They could focus their entire attention on achieving unparalleled accuracy, implicitly trusting the mechanical system to safeguard them from the potentially fatal consequences. Yet, when American intelligence officers meticulously examined captured Stukas in North Africa during 1941 and 1942, they regrettably dismissed the automatic pull-out system as merely characteristic German over-engineering. The American aviation community harbored a deep-seated cultural skepticism toward automation. The prevailing ethos dictated that pilots were inherently responsible for flying their aircraft, not for allowing machines to usurp their role. The pervasive attitude was that properly trained aviators should not require mechanical assistance to prevent blacking out. They should simply strive to be superior pilots. This deeply ingrained attitude persisted even as the mounting piles of accident reports continued to grow. When Navy test pilots evaluated a captured Ju-87 at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, their official report did indeed note the presence of the automatic pull-out system, but disparagingly characterized it as a mere crutch for pilots of insufficient skill, rather than recognizing it as a pragmatic solution to a fundamental physiological problem. That gravely flawed assessment would tragically cost additional American lives for another 8 agonizing months before the harsh realities of the situation finally compelled a crucial and overdue doctrinal shift. A critical doctrinal shift was necessitated by a series of alarming incidents. Air Group 3 of the USS Yorktown was esteemed for its unerring accuracy, a reputation hard-earned and widely acknowledged. These aviators were not nascent recruits fresh from introductory flight courses. Rather, they were formidable combat veterans whose skills had been honed in the brutal Solomons campaign, individuals capable of precisely delivering a 1,000-pound ordnance package onto a destroyer's deck from an astonishing altitude of 10,000 feet. Yet, on March 22, 1943, during what was intended to be a standardized practice maneuver off the sun-drenched Florida coast, Lieutenant Robert Chen catastrophically failed to execute the critical recovery from his dive. His vigilant wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, observed with growing horror as Chen's Dauntless maintained its perilous angle well past the designated release point, bypassing the altitude where a pullout should have commenced, until it plunged into the ocean in a perpendicular descent that left virtually no salvageable debris. This tragic loss marked the squadron's third fatality within a mere fortnight, and it would, distressingly, not be the final one. Just 5 days subsequent to that grim event, Lieutenant William Stamper commenced his descent during the identical training exercise. His radio remained ominously quiet. His aircraft steadfastly maintained its unwavering course. Observers stationed on the Yorktown's flight deck watched through powerful binoculars as Stamper's SPD held its dive through every calibrated altitude marker, anticipating a recovery maneuver that, heartbreakingly, never materialized. The subsequent impact generated a towering geyser of spray, a stark white plume visible across many miles of open water. Stamper, remarkably, had served as Chen's flight instructor. He possessed a distinguished record, having survived the ferocious carrier engagements at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, and had logged an impressive tally of over 300 carrier landings. To perish during a training exercise he could execute with effortless proficiency was a cruel irony. When the squadron returned to the Yorktown that afternoon, its commanding officer immediately grounded the entire dive bomber element, mandating a comprehensive investigation. Admiral Mark Mitcher, who presided over fast carrier task force operations, had reached his limit of tolerance. He promptly issued a directive to the Bureau of Aeronautics, demanding that these tragic occurrences cease being classified as isolated incidents and instead be addressed as a pervasive, institutional malfunction. The exhaustive inquiry that ensued meticulously amassed comprehensive statistical information from every single Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron operating across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The compiled figures proved appalling in their magnitude. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the U.S. Navy had suffered the loss of 47 dive bomber pilots solely due to pull-out failures during training operations, a number exceeding the fatalities incurred from direct enemy action over the identical timeframe. Furthermore, active combat squadrons were reporting that a significant 15 to 20% of their pilots experienced at least partial visual blackout during operational dives, and several critical combat missions had been jeopardized or rendered ineffective when section leaders lost consciousness mid-attack, compelling their wingmen to disengage and escort them to safety. In response, the Bureau assembled an urgent deliberative body at Anacostia Naval Air Station, bringing together a diverse array of experts, distinguished flight surgeons, innovative aircraft designers, seasoned combat squadron leaders, and courageous pilots who had personally endured blackout incidents. For 3 intense days in early April, this panel minutely scrutinized the established tenets of dive bombing technique. Test pilots, equipped with sophisticated medical monitoring apparatus strapped to their chests, undertook instrumented dives. These devices precisely recorded the fluctuations in heart rate, blood pressure, and blood oxygen levels during each distinct phase of the dive and subsequent recovery. Simultaneously, high-speed cameras, strategically mounted in accompanying chase aircraft, captured the exact instant when pilots' heads would involuntarily slump forward or their hands would release control of the stick. The accumulated evidence was irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile, as rigorously taught in every Navy flight school, was inherently taxing beyond human endurance. Pilots were, in essence, being trained to execute a maneuver that human biology was fundamentally incompatible with consistent human survival. The prevailing doctrine clearly had to undergo a radical transformation, yet no member of that distinguished panel could concur on how to implement such a change without simultaneously sacrificing the pinpoint accuracy that initially justified the very existence of dive bombing. The pivotal breakthrough emerged from an unforeseen wellspring of innovation. It did not originate from the ranks of admirals or the medical expertise of flight surgeons, but from a lieutenant junior grade named Thomas Riley, who had been flying perilous combat missions off the venerable Enterprise since the Battle of Midway. Riley had clandestinely adopted a practice that contravened all established tenets of dive bombing doctrine, maintaining a discreet silence regarding his methods because he fully anticipated being reprimanded for his unconventional approach. Instead of initiating his pullout at the stipulated recovery altitude of 2,500 feet and releasing his ordnance during the nascent phase of the recovery arc, Riley had been extending his dives until 2,000 feet, and occasionally even to 1,800 feet, releasing the bomb at a significantly lower altitude where his aircraft was still oriented nearly perpendicular to the Earth's surface. Following this, he would then execute a markedly more gradual pullout, a technique that effectively distributed the gravitational stresses over an extended period. This technique was, by all accounts of the official manual, diametrically opposed to standard operational procedures. Conventional wisdom dictated an early release during the pullout to maximize recovery time. However, Riley's bombing scores were remarkably superior without apparent explanation compared to every other pilot in his squadron, and he had never experienced even a partial visual dimming or grayout. When Riley finally elucidated his innovative technique during the Anacostia Conference, the initial reaction from the assembled experts was profound doubt tinged with outright antagonism. A commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics asserted unequivocally that Riley was fabricating his claims about release altitudes, positing that no pilot could achieve consistent accuracy from below 2,000 feet. The existing bomb sight calculations, he pointed out, did not even possess the parameters to account for releases at such low levels. Nevertheless, Riley possessed irrefutable evidence in the form of gun camera footage. Upon the panel's review of this film, they witnessed something that directly refuted their long-held assumptions regarding bombing accuracy. Riley's bombs were consistently impacting within a circular error probable (CP) of merely 35 feet, a performance markedly superior to the 65-foot CP that was traditionally considered an excellent benchmark for dive bombing precision. The underlying reason for this exceptional accuracy became unequivocally clear once aerodynamicists conducted meticulous computations. The standard technique involved releasing the bomb early in the pull-out arc, at which point the aircraft was transitioning through perhaps 60 degrees of dive angle. At such an angle, the bomb retained significant horizontal velocity, a factor that necessitated intricate calculation and correction. Furthermore, atmospheric wind effects were substantial, rendering the bomb's trajectory an intricate curvilinear path that demanded the pilot to lead the target and precisely account for a multitude of variables. In stark contrast, Riley's ultra-low releases occurred when the aircraft remained nearly vertical, plummeting between 75 and 85 degrees nose down. At this profound angle, the bomb dropped almost straight down with an insignificant horizontal component. Wind effects were, consequently, negligible. The trajectory was, in essence, a straight line from the point of release to the point of impact. It was inherently more straightforward in terms of projectile dynamics, and this very simplicity translated directly into enhanced accuracy. The bomb sight mathematics that had previously seemed incorrect for low releases were, in fact, perfect. They had simply never been properly tested because prevailing doctrine dictated that a pilot would not survive to reach such depths. The advantage concerning G-forces was of comparable import. By prolonging the dive and subsequently executing a more gradual recovery, Riley effectively distributed the equivalent gravitational stress over a span of 7 or 8 seconds, rather than concentrating it into a mere 4 seconds. This methodology resulted in significantly lower peak G-forces, hovering around 4.5 gs instead of the perilous 6 or 7 gs, thereby keeping him securely beneath the physiological limits inducing unconsciousness. Crucially, the gradual onset of these forces afforded his circulatory system an opportunity to adapt. Blood pressure could adjust progressively, allowing him to maintain his anti-G straining maneuvers throughout the entire sequence, rather than having his body's defenses overwhelmed by a sudden, intense spike. Admittedly, this technique demanded considerable fortitude. One was diving deeper into the inherent danger zone before initiating recovery. However, the underlying physics were irrefutable. Lower, slower pullouts unequivocally proved to be both safer and more accurate than the established doctrine that was tragically claiming the lives of pilots week after week. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had been engaged in meticulous aerodynamic investigations into bomb trajectories since 1941. However, the relevance of their extensive data had not been previously recognized or applied to ultra-low altitude releases until Riley's groundbreaking technique necessitated an exhaustive re-examination. When NACA engineers at the renowned Langley Research Center subsequently ran the full aerodynamic models, they unearthed a revelation that, in hindsight, should have been glaringly obvious but had been entirely eclipsed by entrenched, long-standing operational paradigms. The standard 2,500-foot release point had not primarily been selected for its precision merits. Its sole rationale was pilot safety. It was intended to provide aviators with the maximum possible duration to recover should any unforeseen complication arise. However, that safety margin had been predicated upon the flawed assumption that pilots would remain entirely conscious and fully capable throughout the entire pull-out sequence, an assumption that was conclusively erroneous. The meticulously analyzed wind tunnel data unequivocally revealed why lower releases consistently yielded more concentrated strike zones. A bomb released at 2,500 feet during a pull-out would traverse approximately 180 feet of lateral travel before impact. During this extended flight time, it was perpetually vulnerable to atmospheric currents, variations in air density, and the complex aerodynamic interactions between the bomb's stabilizing fins and the turbulent air churned by the diving aircraft. Even minute variations in release timing, differences as slight as a tenth of a second, could translate into a substantial 15 or 20 feet of missed distance from the intended target. Conversely, a bomb released at 1,800 feet in a near-vertical attitude traveled perhaps only 40 feet horizontally before impact. The flight time was significantly curtailed, the trajectory was inherently simpler, and the margin for error was dramatically reduced. Consequently, release timing variations that would induce significant misses at higher altitudes produced negligible deviation at these lower, more precise altitudes. Further bolstering these findings, combat footage analysis provided irrefutable verifiable observational evidence. The U.S. Navy had been diligently collecting gun camera film from every combat mission since the pivotal Battle of Midway, and this invaluable footage contained meticulous sequential documentation of thousands of bomb releases, complete with visible impact points. When seasoned analysts meticulously reviewed this extensive film archive, specifically examining release altitudes and corresponding accuracy, the linkage proved indisputable. Pilots, who executed releases below 2,000 feet, whether intentionally, as Lieutenant Riley had done, or inadvertently by prolonging their dives, consistently demonstrated strike zones 40% more concentrated than pilots adhering to the doctrinal 2,500-foot release. The absolute lowest releases, those occurring between 1,600 and 900 feet, produced accuracies rivaling the precision previously attainable solely through glide bombing attacks, which were executed at significantly reduced speeds. The intricate patterns of G-force distribution unveiled the complete narrative through the meticulous deployment of accelerometers within experimental aircraft. Skilled engineers precisely charted the G-loading profiles for recovery maneuvers initiated at varying altitudes. An aerial recovery maneuver commenced from a relatively higher altitude of 2,500 feet necessitated an immediate and forceful application of maximum back pressure on the control stick. This was because the aviator was rapidly depleting available altitude, compelling an urgent and swift cessation of the steep descent. Such an abrupt and vigorous recovery action invariably induced a perilous G-force surge, peaking between 6 and 7 gs, which frequently resulted in pilot incapacitation due to G-induced loss of consciousness, commonly known as blackouts. Conversely, a recovery initiated from a significantly lower elevation of 1,800 feet afforded the luxury of a more measured and progressive execution, precisely owing to its reduced starting height. While the pilot found himself in closer proximity to the water surface, this position also placed the aircraft in a more acutely vertical orientation, thereby permitting a more extended and graceful recovery arc rather than an abrupt, violent retraction of the control column. The aviator could instead exert a consistent, measured rearward pressure, guiding the aircraft out of its precipitous descent across an extended temporal span. This refined methodology enabled the accomplishment of an identical change in altitude, yet it was achieved through the application of significantly less strenuous and more manageable gravitational forces. The apex of the G-loading remained safely beneath the 5G threshold, a physiological zone comfortably within which pilots could preserve complete cognitive awareness and sustain optimal operational efficacy without impairment. While the conceptual alteration of established operational doctrine represented a significant hurdle, the monumental task of thoroughly re-educating an entire combat aviation contingent to execute procedures diametrically opposed to their deeply ingrained muscle memory presented an entirely distinct and formidable challenge. During the pivotal month of June in 1943, the United States Navy inaugurated a specialized experimental dive bombing school, strategically located at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, operating under the direct and discerning supervision of Commander Fladley. The entire instructional framework and pedagogical approach were meticulously reconstructed from their very foundations, centering on what was officially designated as the delayed pull-out technique, a revolutionary concept in aerial recovery. However, among the aviators themselves, the technique swiftly acquired more colloquial, yet equally evocative, monikers such as riding the edge, or more succinctly, the late pull, reflecting its daring and precise nature. The initial, and perhaps most formidable, obstacle encountered was profoundly psychological. It involved persuading seasoned aviators that deliberately descending to a lower altitude before initiating their recovery was not an act of suicidal imprudence, but rather, paradoxically, represented a demonstrably safer and more effective operational methodology. The comprehensive training regimen commenced with intensive classroom sessions, which, in their rigorous academic content, bore a closer resemblance to advanced physics lectures than to conventional flight briefings, emphasizing the scientific underpinnings of the new technique. Aviators meticulously absorbed detailed presentations elucidating the phenomenon of G-induced loss of consciousness, augmented by intricate charts illustrating cerebral blood flow patterns during extreme high-G maneuvers, and sophisticated graphs correlating the rates of G-force onset with the escalating probability of experiencing a blackout. Specialized flight surgeons provided exhaustive explanations detailing the precise physiological consequences inflicted upon the human visual system when the delicate retinal tissues were deprived of their vital oxygen supply due to sustained high G forces. The dedicated instructors diligently ensured that each pilot fully grasped the fundamental principle that successful execution of this technique was not contingent upon individual valor or superior piloting prowess, but rather was dictated by immutable biological realities. Indeed, even the most courageous and adept aviator on the planet would inevitably succumb to GLOC at 6GS if the recovery maneuver was executed with excessive force and undue haste. Consequently, the primary objective was not to physically resist the overwhelming G-forces, but rather to adroitly manage them, to meticulously distribute their impact across a longer duration, thereby enabling the human body to gradually adapt to the stress rather than experiencing an abrupt and debilitating shutdown. Subsequently, the training transitioned to intensive instrument work. This novel technique imperatively demanded that pilots place absolute reliance upon their altimeters, particularly in harrowing scenarios where every primal instinct vehemently urged an immediate and premature recovery from the dive. Under the watchful guidance of their instructors, aviators engaged in repetitive practice sessions within link trainers, which, despite being rudimentary flight simulators, proved invaluable. Here, they meticulously executed dive profiles repeatedly, concurrently enunciating their current altitudes without interruption. Passing 3,000, holding angle. Passing 2,500, holding angle. Passing 2,000, sight picture, steady. 1,800, initiating pull-out. These precise verbal call-outs served a dual purpose. They effectively maintained the pilot's conscious mental engagement throughout the critical descent phase and crucially counteracted the onset of tunnel vision, a dangerous perceptual narrowing that often preceded a catastrophic loss of altitude awareness. The aviators persevered in their practice until these specific callouts became entirely automatic, transforming into an intrinsic verbal rhythm that would reliably persist and provide guidance even amidst the acute pressures of combat. The practical application of the new technique in actual flight training was introduced through a series of meticulously graduated steps, ensuring a progressive and safe learning curve for the aviators. Initial flights involved rigorous practice dives, intentionally conducted without any live bomb ordnance, with the critical pull-out maneuver commencing at 2,200 feet, a mere 300 feet lower than the previously established conventional doctrine. During these crucial sessions, experienced instructors flew alongside in chase aircraft, providing a constant stream of vital, real-time altitude updates via radio communication. Aviators were systematically trained to discern and interpret the precise visual cues indicative of the 1,800-foot mark, including the apparent size of the designated target, the specific configuration of the horizon's geometry, and the unique sight picture that unequivocally signaled the opportune moment for recovery. They meticulously rehearsed the nuanced, gradual pull-out procedure, mastering the art of applying consistent and steady back pressure to the control stick, a stark contrast to the previous, abrupt, yanking motion. Furthermore, they diligently practiced specialized anti-G straining maneuvers, which were initiated preemptively prior to the pullout, and were sustained continuously throughout the entire recovery sequence to mitigate physiological stress. This included learning to emit a forceful grunt with every breath, simultaneously tensing their leg and abdominal musculature with considerable effort, a physiological technique designed to effectively trap blood in the upper torso and brain, thereby countering the downward displacement caused by G-forces. By August of 1943, the Naval Air Station Jacksonville was successfully certifying aviators who demonstrated the consistent capability to release their ordnance from altitudes ranging between 1,700 and 900 feet, achieving remarkable circular error probables of less than 40 feet, and crucially, experiencing absolutely no G-induced incidents during their recovery maneuvers. Although this enhanced training regimen extended the instructional period by an additional 3 weeks compared to the previous curriculum, the tangible results it produced were utterly incontrovertible and overwhelmingly positive. Operational squadrons integrating these freshly trained pilots subsequently reported significant improvements in bombing accuracy, ranging from 35% to an impressive 50%, when contrasted with units still employing the older, conventional dive bombing methods. Even more critically, the alarming rate of training accidents plummeted to virtually negligible levels, marking a profound enhancement in pilot safety. Despite these successes, a lingering apprehension persisted among the pilots. Executing a dive to 1,800 feet before initiating the pullout still demanded every fiber of their professional discipline and mental fortitude. Yet, the paramount outcome was that aviators were no longer succumbing to fatal accidents. The efficacy of the technique was unequivocally proven, and the imperative now fell upon the Navy to rapidly disseminate and implement this vital new methodology across every carrier air group operating in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, prior to the commencement of any subsequent large-scale military operations. The groundbreaking delayed pullout technique underwent its inaugural large-scale combat evaluation during Operation Forager, the crucial invasion of the Marianas Archipelago, which unfolded in June of 1944. For this monumental engagement, Task Force 58 deployed a formidable armada of 15 fleet carriers into the strategic Philippine Sea, with every single dive bomber squadron within these groups having been meticulously retrained in the principles of the new doctrine over the preceding 8 months, ensuring widespread adoption. Then, on the fateful day of June 19th, amidst the aerial maelstrom that would later be immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers were presented with the decisive opportunity for their ultimate operational validation. Japanese carrier forces unleashed a torrent of massive aerial strikes, a relentless assault that rapidly overwhelmed American combat air patrol controllers. Consequently, an urgent directive was issued for the dive bombers to pivot from their primary mission of engaging enemy vessels and instead retasked to intercepting the incoming Japanese strike packages before they could pose a direct threat to the American fleet. The subsequent engagement constituted an unparalleled trial of precision bombing capabilities under the most demanding and dynamic combat conditions imaginable. In this critical moment, Lieutenant Commander James Ramage spearheaded Bombing Squadron 10, operating from the venerable USS Enterprise, in a daring assault against a formidable formation of Japanese carrier bombers positioned at an altitude of 12,000 feet, an elevation at which traditional dive bombing techniques had historically been deemed, at best, marginally effective. Employing the newly perfected delayed pull-out technique, his skilled pilots commenced their steep descents from a considerable high altitude, maintaining their perilous dives directly through the core of the enemy formation, and executing their ordnance releases at altitudes plummeting below 2,000 feet, all while maintaining blistering speeds exceeding 280 knots. The resultant bombing accuracy achieved was nothing short of devastating in its effectiveness. Subsequent post-action analysis unequivocally credited VB-10 with the destruction or significant damage of an astonishing 23 Japanese aircraft in a singular, decisive pass, a level of precision that would have been utterly unattainable and deemed impossible using the outdated, high-altitude release methods. Lieutenant Commander Ramage's personal ordnance strike was so extraordinarily precise that his bomb directly impacted a K-torpedo bomber, resulting in an explosion of such force that it scattered its shattered wreckage across an impressive quarter-mile radius. Remarkably, not one single aviator within his squadron reported experiencing even a partial blackout during their arduous recovery maneuvers, a testament to the technique's physiological benefits. The statistical data meticulously compiled from the Marianas operation provided a comprehensive and compelling account of the new technique's efficacy. Dive bomber squadrons, rigorously trained in and employing the delayed pull-out technique, consistently attained remarkable hit rates of 32% when engaging agile, maneuvering enemy warships, a significant leap compared to the historical averages of 18% to 22% recorded in previous naval engagements. Furthermore, during the critical strikes launched against Japanese aircraft carriers on June 20th, ordnance released from altitudes beneath 2,000 feet was directly responsible for 14 of the total 18 direct hits officially credited to American dive bombers, underscoring the technique's pinpoint accuracy. A particularly illustrative example was the Japanese carrier HIO, which sustained 3 devastating bomb strikes in rapid succession from pilots of Bombing Squadron 2, VB-2, all of whom released their payloads between 1,500 and 1,850 feet. Their precision was so extraordinary that 2 of these bombs penetrated the flight deck and converged into the very same elevator shaft. The HIO succumbed to its damage and sank within a matter of hours. Subsequent post-war analysis of the sunken wreckage revealed impact patterns remarkably clustered within a mere 50-foot circle, a level of unerring accuracy that would have been considered utterly inconceivable and technically impossible only 18 months prior. Pilot survival statistics, recorded during the 6-month period immediately succeeding the comprehensive implementation of the delayed pull-out training, demonstrated an equally profound and dramatic enhancement in aircrew safety. Incidents of G-induced loss of consciousness, GLOC, plummeted by an astounding 91% across all operational carrier air groups, virtually eradicating a once pervasive and dangerous problem. The combat loss rates specifically attributable to dive accidents concurrently diminished to statistically insignificant levels, representing fewer than one pilot loss per 1,000 sorties flown, a stark and welcome contrast to the grim figure of 15 per 1,000 recorded during the perilous early months of 1943. Evidently, this innovative technique had unequivocally resolved the debilitating blackout crisis in its entirety. However, its impact extended beyond mere problem-solving. It had achieved something far more significant. It had fundamentally revolutionized the operational capabilities and tactical potential of dive bombing itself. The newfound capacity to accurately release ordnance from ultra-low altitudes transformed dive bombers into exceptionally potent weapons, enabling them to effectively engage and neutralize targets that had, in previous operational contexts, necessitated the coordinated efforts of multiple squadrons. Individual aircraft were now capable of achieving decisive mission kills against formidable destroyers, while coordinated two-plane sections possessed the sufficient destructive power to effectively disable larger cruisers, showcasing a dramatic increase in operational efficiency and lethality. By the commencement of the rigorous Okinawa campaign in April 1945, the delayed pull-out methodology had become so profoundly and seamlessly woven into the fabric of dive bomber doctrine that newly commissioned pilots emerging from the training command were entirely unaware that any alternative technique had ever existed. So complete was its adoption. These nascent aviators had been rigorously instructed to sustain their exhilarating descents down to a mere 1,800 feet from their initial training flights, rendering the antiquated high-altitude release procedures appear astonishingly and even dangerously inaccurate in comparison. The conclusive statistics gathered from the entirety of the Pacific War unequivocally demonstrated that dive bombers, whose crews were proficient in the delayed pull-out technique, achieved a staggering 47% increase in enemy shipping sunk or damaged per sortie, when measured against squadrons still adhering to the pre-1943 operational protocols. This unparalleled success was accomplished with significantly reduced loss rates, markedly improved pilot survival statistics, and a level of surgical accuracy that fundamentally redefined the dive bomber, elevating it from a mere area weapon to an indispensable precision instrument of war. What had initially been perceived as a suicidally perilous technique in 1943 had, by the war's conclusion, evolved into the benchmark against which all other aerial bombing methodologies were critically evaluated and found wanting. The intrepid pilots, who had cultivated the profound discipline to trust empirical physics over visceral instinct, and who had meticulously trained themselves to prolong those terrifying, screaming dives for just a few critical seconds beyond what every natural impulse and nerve ending in their bodies commanded, had, in essence, irrevocably rewritten the fundamental rules of naval aviation. Their profound achievement was ultimately forged by their mastery of the art of the late pullout.